Hey, everybody. I hope you did awesome on your test yesterday. We are moving into our final chapter. So just to kind of give you a rundown of the rest of the year, we have this chapter, and then we have our final. We have an essay, and that's it. We're done. There's a final map, though, and a final test. So I will be posting that material shortly after we finish this test for you to start on, and then we'll be ready to roll. Remember, this chapter does have a combined map from the last chapter. So we studied it for 13 and 14. So make sure you have that down as we go through this chapter. All right, let's go ahead and get into the discussion here. We're talking about the Civil War. A lot of you have been waiting a long time for this, so hopefully it doesn't disappoint. So remember, last chapter ended with Lincoln being elected, basically, and that election happened because the Democratic Party split. Right, Northern Democrats wanted one candidate, Henry Clay. The Southern Democrats wanted another one, John Calhoun, and they disagreed. They split votes amongst themselves. They didn't vote for one candidate. They voted for several candidates. And Lincoln snuck in between and took all the rest of the votes. So he won. Basically, the big fear for the South at this point is that he was going to try and pass laws that would outlaw slavery in general. He was going to first stop the spread of slavery into the territories, and then next try and get rid of slavery within the states. That was the goal of the Republican Party. Their first main goal was to stop the spread of slavery. Second goal was to end slavery altogether. So it made sense that they were afraid of this. They also feared that Lincoln, because he was a Northerner, cared more about the North. He would probably raise tariffs again, which they didn't like. So in December of 1860, before Lincoln has even become president yet, the South Carolina actually officially seceded from the Union and became an independent nation. Remember, Lincoln has been elected in November. December, South Carolina secedes. Lincoln's not even inaugurated until February, right? So he can't really do anything. This is a quote from Lincoln. "Slavery is founded on the selfishness of man's nature, opposition to it on his love of justice." So obviously he thinks that Southerners that are slaveholders and support slavery are selfish, and he views himself as in the right here. So Lincoln at first, again, before he's even president, actually starts writing to South Carolina, trying to keep them in the Union. He basically said, hey, if you stay in the Union, I won't make any laws about slavery in the states, and I will continue to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. But basically, I'm going to need your promise that I'm okay to make laws about not allowing slavery into new states, right? That was his compromise. Like, I won't touch slavery in your states. I just don't want it in new states. However, the South basically, one, didn't like that plan, but also they didn't trust Lincoln to keep his end of the bargain. And so they continued with secession. South Carolina was just the first one, but many others follow. By February, when Lincoln actually takes office, 7 states had already seceded. So South Carolina joined by Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. These states form a new country called the Confederate States of America. Confederate just means united. So it's just kind of another United States of America. They had their own constitution, and it was very similar to the United States one, with some differences. One big difference being that slavery was explicitly protected in the Constitution. And then they elected their president, their first and only president, Jefferson Davis. That's Jefferson on the left with his weird goatee, and there's their flag. And that's what those states look like here. So you can see border states are shown differently here. We're going to talk about how important they are in a little while, but you can see the blue ones are our Union states. Those are states that stayed in the Union but also didn't have slavery. The border states did stay in the Union, but they had slavery. And then these red ones, of course, are the Confederate states. That's why they're separated out. There's not really a big canyon in between those states in real life, just in case you were wondering. All right, so President Buchanan at the time, he was actually elected because he didn't want to do anything about slavery, right? And so all of this stuff starts happening around him in his last few months in office, and he just basically watches it happen. Matter of fact, he even caught the Secretary of War, transferring a bunch of material to the South towards the end of Buchanan's presidency, he just starts moving stuff south and basically stealing it, and he doesn't really do anything about it. So he just basically watches the United States crumble. Kind of sad. He didn't think it was his fault. It wasn't his mess, and somebody else had to deal with it. So Lincoln finally becomes president. It's actually March. Sorry, I said February earlier, but he's finally inaugurated in March, and basically he had to deal with this huge problem now. Lincoln's main goal at the beginning of his presidency, was to just save the Union. His whole job is just to preserve the Union. The Union is the nickname for the 24 states that didn't leave, that didn't secede. Basically, his first promise was, I will not send troops to the South. I am not going to fight. I'm not going to start this fight. He refused to start a fight, but he wanted to keep the United States together. The first real action that happened was at a place called Fort Sumter. A lot of United States forts that were in the South had actually started to fall to the South. They've just basically turned over their command to the Confederate States of America, even though they were United States property. They started taking control of these facilities all over the place. One of them that held strong was actually Fort Sumter. This was one of only 4 forts still in the South that was still held by the United States. But the big problem was that Fort Sumter was running out of supplies. So Lincoln had to make a big choice here. He promised not to start a fight. He promised not to send troops to the South, right? He already had troops in the South. He promised not to send any more. But he has to choose. Does he withdraw these troops and let the South have Fort Sumter? Or does he send troops to reinforce them? Or does he just send supplies? So he actually decides to only send supplies. He doesn't send ammunition. He doesn't send weapons. He doesn't send soldiers, just food so that they can stay in that fort. And now he forces the South to make a choice. This is going to be important because Lincoln is smart. Lincoln's a smart guy, and he knows that other countries are watching this. If we're going to hope for the support of other countries later on, or more importantly, if we want the South to look bad so no other countries will support them, this is important. He basically forces the South to decide, do you let me send food to these troops and keep them there? Do you fire the first shot, right? What are you going to do? And so the Southerners, President Davis actually ordered his army to attack the fort before the supplies could arrive. After 34 hours, the fort was just bombed for 34 hours. Not a single Union soldier died, but the fort was basically demolished. Major Anderson, who was in charge of the fort, basically saw that it was crumbled and it was basically a useless hunk of rock anyway. So he just said, okay, you can have this hunk of rock, and he surrendered to the Confederates. Here's a painting. You know how I feel about artists' rendering of history. Probably wildly inaccurate, but oh well, it's kind of cool looking. So basically, the rest of the states had to decide who they were going to join. So I think on our last list, we had 8 states. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah. They were now joined by Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. The states that had been kind of on the fence now are basically like, okay, war is starting. Who do we support? They joined with the Confederate States, and they made their capital in Richmond, Virginia, which my geography might be slightly off, but I think it's less than 200 miles away from DC, which is our capital. It's like 150 miles, something like that. Somebody will correct me at some point, but that's okay. Anyway, so the capital, Richmond, Virginia, just right down the road from DC. And then there were 23 states that remained in the Union. And actually part of Virginia actually didn't want to join the South. So they actually petitioned the US to make them their own state. And we did actually. We're like, yeah, sure. You want to join us? That's great. And so West Virginia actually split off from Virginia at this point. It becomes 2 separate states. West Virginia stayed in the Union, and Virginia went to the South. So there you go. Again, this is just a zoomed in of that same map that I showed you earlier, but you'll see those border states, super important. So they're unique because they are slave states, but stayed loyal to the North. There's 5 big ones here: Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. They're Very important, but they do also make it difficult for Lincoln, because remember, Lincoln does want to get rid of slavery eventually, but he has to kind of tiptoe around the slavery issue, because if he comes down hard and says this war is all about slavery, then he risks pushing these border states into the Confederacy, right? He wants to keep them on his side, so he can't be super harsh about slavery at first, especially. Um, so it kind of makes it interesting here. One big reason he has to keep them is because DC would then be surrounded. If Maryland joins the South, then we have our capital completely surrounded by enemies. With Maryland as a Union state, we have that northern border of Washington DC still ours, right? It's only just down the road from there. So hugely important to have them there. Excuse me. And then just for numbers, of course. But basically, this makes it so Lincoln can't do certain things that he might have otherwise. One big decision that he has to make because of the border states is not to allow Black people to join the army, whether they were freed Blacks or others, right? Some slaveholders actually wanted to volunteer to send some of their slaves to fight in the war, and a lot of those slaves would have gone willingly because they saw this war about slavery. And so he couldn't do that because those border states, imagine if you're marching an army through the border states to attack the South and half of the soldiers are Black. What's that going to do to the slaves that are in Maryland or in Kentucky or wherever? A lot of those slaves are going to get restless. They're going to feel like they should be fighting or something like that, right? And so he says basically, okay, we can't have Blacks fighting this war right now, which plays a big role. He'll change that decision later, but we'll talk about that at another point. That is the end of today's lecture. Make sure you do your homework, submit that, catch up on anything you're behind on, and we will talk to you tomorrow. Adios.